Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. They say losing a husband after a lifetime together leaves a silence no prayer can fill. I thought the hardest part of old age would be learning to sleep alone until the day I held a ticket worth $18 million. That blessing became the seed of betrayal. My daughter-in-law smiled sweetly in public while whispering, I was losing my mind, slipping sedatives into my tea, forging my name on bank papers, building a case to steal everything I had left. But lies always leave traces. A hidden camera caught her hand stirring poison into my cup. The bank confirmed the forgery and the night police locked the cuffs around her wrists. My grandson clung to me as if I were the only safe place left in his world. My name is Anna Reed, and this is my story. I still remember the way the house in Portland smelled the morning I locked the front door for the last time. It was a mix of cedar from the old beams and faint traces of David's cologne that lingered on the closet shelves. I pressed my hand against the cool brass of the doorknob, and for a moment I wanted to take it with me, as if carrying that weight would keep him close. But the realtor was waiting outside with the papers, and I had already signed away the place we had called home for almost 50 years. The sale brought in enough to give me security, added to the life insurance and the monthly pension that came in like clockwork. On paper, I was fine, comfortable even, but in reality, I felt like a tree uprooted. After David's passing in 2019, I tried to stay busy volunteering at the library, baking for the neighbors, filling the silence with crossword puzzles. Yet the walls seemed to grow heavier every night. Andrew called often, always, with a mixture of warmth and worry in his voice. He had moved to Seattle years ago, built a small but thriving architecture firm, married Sophie last summer, and was raising Ethan, my only grandson. Every call ended the same way, with him urging me to move closer. He promised that Ethan would love having me around, that Sophie wanted me to be part of their new family, that the city would give me more than a quiet suburban street and fading memories. It took me months to agree, but when I did, Andrew sounded relieved, almost triumphant. We looked at condos, at first something modest and manageable, but he and Sophie insisted I stay with them until I found my footing. Their house in Ballard was sleek all glass and like nothing like the creaky craftsman David and I had tended for decades. I worried I would be in the way an antique piece in a showroom of modern lines, but I packed anyway. The drive north was gray with drizzle, the kind of rain that slicked the roads and made the tires hum. Boxes filled the back seat labeled with shaky handwriting, each one a little piece of my old life. At a rest stop, I opened one marked kitchen and touched the handle of the cast iron skillet David used for Saturday pancakes. I closed it quickly, afraid of what might spill out if I lingered too long. When I pulled into Andrew's driveway, Ethan burst out of the front door, his hair flopping into his eyes. He shouted "Grandma" like it was the best word he knew, and wrapped himself around my waist before I could set my purse down. That moment alone almost made the move worth it. Sophie followed, elegant in her navy sweater, smiling with polite brightness. She helped me carry the lighter boxes, and I noticed her perfume was sharp citrusy, so different from the lavender I had always worn. Inside the house gleamed. Hardwood floors reflected the recessed lighting, and wide windows showed off a neat garden where hydrangeas were trying to bloom. Andrew hugged me tight and said we would make this work, that it was a new chapter for all of us. I nodded, swallowing the unease that rose when I saw how carefully curated everything was. My crocheted afghans and framed wedding photo looked like intruders in the spare guest room they had prepared. That night, we ate Thai takeout at the long oak table. Ethan chattered about school, about soccer practice, and a science project involving volcanoes. Sophie asked about my drive, about whether I liked green tea instead of black. I answered politely, though my mind wandered to David's absence. At one point, I reached for a spring roll and almost called out his name to pass me the sauce. My hand trembled and I dropped the spoon. Sophie noticed and offered a small controlled smile. Later in the guest room, I unpacked slowly. Each drawer I filled seemed to echo with questions. Was I imposing? Was this truly what David would have wanted for me? I placed his photo on the nightstand, his eyes twinkling under a fishing cap, and whispered that I was trying. The city outside was louder than I remembered cars rushing by even at midnight, but exhaustion eventually carried me into sleep. The following morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Ethan's laughter. I padded downstairs in my slippers to find Andrew reading emails at the counter, Ethan building Lego towers on the floor, and Sophie arranging fruit in a glass bowl. She greeted me cheerfully and offered toast. I thanked her, though I noticed how her eyes flicked to the crumbs I left near the butter dish. It was a small thing, but it planted a seed of self-consciousness. Over the next week, I settled into a rhythm. I walked Ethan to school a few mornings, holding his hand as we crossed the busy streets, and he proudly introduced me to his teacher. I cooked dinner twice my chicken pot pie, filling the house with a smell that made Andrew close his eyes in nostalgia. Sophie ate politely, but later suggested that we try lighter meals for health. I nodded, though. Inside I felt a pang. At night, I sat by the window with a book, but often found myself staring at the city lights instead. I missed the sound of crickets, the hush of the Portland yard at dusk. Yet I also cherished the moments when Ethan would crawl into my lap with a blanket and fall asleep while I stroked his hair. Those moments told me I still had a place, even if the furniture around me was unfamiliar. One evening, Andrew and I sat on the back patio while Sophie put Ethan to bed. He asked if I was happy here. I told him I was grateful that being near him and Ethan filled a part of me that had been empty for years. He squeezed my hand, said he wanted me to feel at home, that we were building something new together. I wanted to believe him fully, but I felt the shadow of distance even as he spoke. When I went inside later, Sophie was in the kitchen rinsing glasses. She looked up and said she hoped I was comfortable, that she wanted me to feel welcome. Her tone was warm but measured, as if she was rehearsing kindness. I smiled and told her I appreciated everything. We stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the gap before I excused myself to my room. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing deeply. This was only the beginning, I told myself. I had made the choice to come here, to step into their lives. The past was packed away in boxes, and the future waited just beyond the hallway. I lay down and let the city's distant sirens lull me, unsure of what tomorrow might bring. The first morning in the new house felt both bright and hollow. Sunlight spilled through wide glass windows, too clear and polished as if it belonged to someone else's life. I folded the sheets of the guest bed and smoothed the pillow the way David always liked it, then walked downstairs to the smell of coffee already brewing. Sophie greeted me with a cheerful smile that looked practiced, a little too bright, and told me she had set out a mug for me. Her tone was polite and careful, not unkind, but something about it carried the weight of rehearsal. I thanked her and sipped the coffee, letting the warmth steady me. Ethan bounded into the room, hair sticking out in every direction, and asked if I would walk him to school. My heart lifted, and I agreed right away. Andrew was already rushing out the door, talking about traffic and client calls. I held Ethan's hand down the street, listening to him chatter about his favorite soccer move and a new joke he had learned. His trust in me gave me a sense of belonging I was desperate to feel. When I returned, Sophie was on the back patio with her phone pressed to her ear. The sliding door was open just enough that her voice drifted inside. I tried to busy myself with the dishes, but her words carried clearly. She told the neighbor that I was sweet but a little forgetful. She laughed softly and said I had put the milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator. My chest tightened. I remembered carrying that carton yesterday cold against my hand and placing it carefully in the refrigerator door. I stood frozen at the sink until the sound of the sliding door startled me. She stepped inside and, seeing me there, smiled as if nothing had been said. She asked if I had what I needed for dinner. My voice came out flat when I said yes. The moment clung to me all afternoon. I checked the refrigerator. The milk stood exactly where I had left it. I stared at it, felt my hands tremble, then grabbed a notepad by the phone and wrote the time, the date, and the exact location of the carton. Writing steadied me. It was proof, even if only to myself, that my mind was clear. At dinner that night, Andrew told a story about work while Ethan giggled over mashed potatoes. Sophie waited until the plates were nearly empty before she spoke. She smiled sweetly and mentioned to Andrew how I loved telling the story about winning the spelling bee when I was a girl. She said I had told it 3 times in the last week. My fork paused midair. I remembered telling it once to Ethan after he brought home a ribbon once to Andrew when he teased me about crossword puzzles. Twice, not 3. Andrew chuckled and said lightly that everyone repeats themselves sometimes, but I saw the quick flicker in his eyes, a sliver of doubt. Sophie touched her glass, satisfied. I felt my face heat, but I forced a calm smile. That night I opened a small notebook I had packed away and began to write. I wrote down what time I had set the table, what story I had told where I placed the milk, what book I had read before bed. I wrote every detail as if I were building a fortress around myself. When I finished, I placed the notebook under my pillow and lay awake, listening to the hum of the city outside. Over the next days, I kept adding to the notebook. I listed where I put the eggs, which street I took on my walk, what page I had read to Ethan before bed. The act of writing gave me back control. I began labeling pantry bins and stacking groceries carefully so nothing could be twisted against me. Sophie noticed and complimented my organization, her smile smooth, her eyes unreadable. She suggested a family planner on the wall so we could all stay coordinated. Andrew agreed. I nodded, but inside I decided to photograph each page before it was erased. One afternoon, while trimming the hydrangeas in the garden, I met Carol from down the street. She told me Sophie had mentioned I was a retired teacher. Carol's tone was kind, not mocking, and for a moment I felt the old version of myself returning. We chatted about children and books, and I felt lighter walking back inside. That evening at dinner, Sophie brought up an article she had read about memory lapses in older adults. She said it conversationally as if sharing the weather, but her eyes flicked toward me. Andrew frowned slightly but said nothing. I swallowed my anger and instead told them about a crossword clue I had solved that morning, recalling the answer in detail. My calm tone seemed to surprise her. The notebook grew thicker with each passing day. I wrote about Ethan's soccer practice, about the exact words on Sophie's lips when she said she hoped I did not feel overwhelmed about Andrew's tired smile when he returned late from work. I wrote about every time I proved my own awareness, not because I needed convincing, but because I sensed the shadows Sophie was casting. One morning, I poured cereal for Ethan, careful to place the milk carton right in the door afterward. Sophie breezed in her perfume sharp and glanced at the pantry. She mentioned casually that sometimes new environments can be confusing. She reached out and touched my sleeve gently, saying she hoped I was adjusting. I looked her in the eye and answered evenly that I was doing just fine. For a moment, her smile faltered. That night after the house quieted, I sat at the desk in my room with the notebook open. I added the latest details, then pressed my hand over the page. The rhythm of the pen on paper steadied me. Whatever Sophie's intentions were, I knew one thing clearly. My mind was sound. I would keep proving it day after day, line after line, until there could be no doubt. The first strange incident came on a Tuesday morning when I was getting ready to take Ethan to school. I reached for my purse on the dresser and noticed my house key was missing from the little leather strap where it always hung. I checked the pockets of my coat, the kitchen counter, even the laundry basket. My hands grew clammy as I retraced every step from the day before. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her hair perfectly smooth, holding the missing key between two fingers. She said she had found it on the mudroom floor and smiled as if amused. I thanked her, though my heart was racing. I knew I had never set foot in the mudroom with that key. Later that day, I wrote down the entire episode in my notebook, noting the time and Sophie's words exactly. The act of recording it steadied me, but unease clung like a damp coat. A week later, I went to take my morning pills, a simple set for blood pressure and vitamins. I kept them neatly in a plastic organizer, each day marked clearly. That morning, the Wednesday compartment was empty, though I was sure I had not taken them yet. The pills were sitting in the Saturday slot, instead jumbled. I froze with the container in my hand. Sophie passed by the open doorway and noticed my confusion. She tilted her head and asked if I was having trouble keeping track. My mouth went dry. I told her calmly that someone must have knocked the organizer. She nodded slowly and said these things happen. At dinner that evening, she mentioned lightly to Andrew that she had noticed me struggling with my medicine. She phrased it with concern, her eyes wide with practiced sympathy. Andrew looked at me, uncertainty shadowing his expression. I insisted the pills had simply spilled, but I could tell he was unsettled. Ethan stared at me with wide eyes, confused, and asked if I was sick. I smiled at him and assured him I was fine, my stomach tightening as Sophie reached for the salad bowl with serene patience. Days later, another incident made me shiver. I returned from a walk around the block and stepped into the kitchen to find a faint hiss. The gas burner knob was turned just enough to release a stream of fuel. My chest clenched as I rushed to twist it off. The smell clung in the air. Sophie walked in right as I was fanning the window open. She raised her eyebrows and asked if I had forgotten to turn it off. Her tone was calm but edged with accusation. I told her firmly that I had not used the stove that morning. She gave a soft sigh and said she understood how overwhelming transitions could be. When Andrew came home, she mentioned the incident in passing, not accusing, but dropping it like a pebble in water. I watched him process the words, doubt flickering across his face again. He tried to mask it with a smile when he glanced at me, but the seed had been planted. Ethan picked up on the tension, though he could not understand it. He began asking me if I was okay when I tucked him into bed, as if afraid I might disappear. One night he whispered that Mom said sometimes older people forget things. My throat tightened, but I hugged him close and told him my mind was strong. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way children absorb unspoken currents in a household. The air in the house grew heavier each day. Simple interactions carried hidden edges. Sophie smiled at me with polished warmth, but her eyes always measured. Andrew seemed caught between us, listening carefully, yet unsure which version of events to believe. I began double-checking everything. I locked the front door and pulled on the knob 3 times. I photographed the stove knobs after cooking. I wrote notes on sticky pads and left them in plain view. Still, Sophie had a way of arriving at the perfect moment always when something looked wrong. If a dish towel was left crumpled on the counter, she would appear to smooth it out and comment gently about forgetfulness. If mail was left unopened for an hour, she would remark to Andrew that I might be overwhelmed. Each moment was small on its own, but together they built a picture, one I could feel her shaping like wet clay. One evening after dinner, I noticed Andrew studying me as I told Ethan a bedtime story. His expression carried both love and doubt, as though he was measuring my words against the subtle hints Sophie had dropped. I finished the story with a smile, but inside my heart pounded. Later, alone in my room, I opened the notebook and wrote until my feet cramped. I detailed every incident, every word, every time Sophie found something that had never been lost. The ink on the page was my lifeline. I realized then with a cold certainty that this was no series of accidents. It was a pattern deliberate designed to weave a portrait of me that was not true. Sophie was not just sowing doubt with careless remarks. She was constructing something more dangerous, a record she wanted Andrew and perhaps others to believe. I set the pen down and pressed my palms to the desk, breathing slowly. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. Somewhere down the hall, Sophie's voice drifted in a soft laugh. I closed my eyes and promised myself I would not let her rewrite who I was. I had survived grief, loneliness, and change. I would survive this too, though the path ahead was quickly darkening. The morning felt damp and heavy as I poured hot water into my mug. Sophie drifted into the kitchen with that flawless smile, asking whether I had ever spoken to a financial advisor. She praised me for being so organized, then slipped in questions about my pension, whether it arrived monthly, how much the life insurance had been, and where I had kept the money from selling the house. She spoke as if curious, but her eyes measured every word I gave. I told her calmly that my planner in Portland had already arranged things and that I preferred to keep life simple. She nodded and said simplicity was wise, though she lingered on the idea of inflation and modern times. Andrew walked in tie-loose shoulders stiff. He admitted the firm was struggling, cash flow tight, bills stacking up. He said 2 projects had stalled and the debt was creeping toward $200,000. His voice cracked when he said it aloud. Sophie reached for his arm and reminded him that families sometimes pool resources. He gave a small shrug and said he would manage. I sat very still, my chest tight. Later that afternoon, Ethan sat in the back seat on the drive home from soccer and asked what it meant to sign for someone else. My hands tightened on the wheel. I asked where he had heard that. He said he had overheard Mom saying it might be easier if she signed things for Grandma. He looked confused, then said, I could write my name better than anyone. I smiled at him, but inside a chill spread. When we got home, Sophie was arranging the mail into piles. She mentioned casually that the bank had sent a brochure about retirees and how helpful it was to name a trusted person for signatures. She offered to go over it with me. I told her politely that I had no need to change anything. Her smile stayed steady, but her eyes did not. That evening, Andrew confessed again that the business was drowning in late payments. Sophie used his fatigue like an open door. She told him stress could wear a man down and that it might be time to let the family help. Then she looked at me and said it would be easier if someone younger handled routine accounts, that I should not have to juggle bills. I folded my napkin and told her softly that my attorney had already prepared everything in Portland and that I was comfortable. She kept smiling, but pressed on naming local firms as if the names had been rehearsed. The next morning, I stopped by my bank branch. I confirmed my accounts were in my sole name and asked that no changes be made without my in-person approval. The manager printed a note for my records. I slipped it into my folder and wrote the details in my notebook. Just the act of securing my ground steadied me. At dinner that night, Ethan was coloring rockets at the table. Out of nowhere, he asked if I needed help with my signature. My fork stopped halfway. He explained that he had heard Mom tell Aunt Claire that older people should not have to sign so many papers. He looked eager, proud to be useful. I took his hand and told him gently that signing was a promise, one I wanted to keep myself. He accepted my answer, but I saw how easily seeds are planted in a child's mind. Later, Andrew leaned against the window shadows under his eyes. He whispered that he did not want me to feel pressured, but that the numbers were not shrinking. I told him I would help with dinner's errands and Ethan, but that my savings were the result of years of careful choices with his father. He nodded, torn between love and exhaustion. Not long after, Sophie appeared with a spreadsheet she had prepared. She called it a convenience plan. She proposed consolidating accounts, adding a joint signer for household expenses, even granting limited authority for medical and billing. She suggested a trial period just 3 months. Andrew stood quietly watching. He did not push, but he did not object either. I asked what expenses she meant. She listed groceries, utilities, soccer fees, all framed as family sharing. I told her I preferred to cover Ethan's needs directly and that bills should remain their responsibility. She softened her voice and said she respected boundaries, but that a shared calendar would at least keep everyone on track. I agreed only to look at the calendar. That night, when the house finally grew quiet, I sat with my notebook. I wrote down every phrase, every number, every plan Sophie had proposed. I recorded that Andrew admitted the debt that Sophie mentioned signing rights that Ethan had asked about my signature. I noted the consultation Sophie claimed to have scheduled with a local attorney and reminded myself to see my own lawyer first. The money in my accounts was not just numbers. It was decades of life with David, our home in Portland, our sacrifices and steady work. It was the promise of independence I had earned. Sophie's questions, her rehearsed suggestions, even her gentle touch on Andrew's arm told me she had already drawn a map of what she wanted. She was patient, precise, and unrelenting. I placed the notebook beneath my pillow and turned out the light. In the dark, I listened to the hum of the heater and the faint creak of the house. My breathing slowed as I shaped my next move. I would not let her bend me into the figure she was trying to build. Tomorrow I would begin by calling my attorney, and until then I would guard every step, every signature, every word. The chill of realization kept me awake long after the house had gone still. By morning my chest felt heavy, and I knew I needed to breathe different air. I called Linda Tran, a friend I had not seen in months, and asked if she could meet for lunch. Her voice came through warm and steady, the same voice I remembered from decades ago when she worked as a nurse and helped me through Ethan's birth. We met at a small diner in Bellevue, the kind with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that had not worked in years. Linda looked the same, silver hair pulled back in a bun, eyes that always seemed to see more than people wanted to reveal. We ordered coffee, and before the waitress set down the mugs, I told her about Sophie. I spoke quietly, my hands twisting the napkin in my lap, recounting the missing keys, the misplaced pills the gas burner left open, the questions about my accounts, the way Andrew's debt gave Sophie a platform to push. Linda listened without interrupting, her lips pressed together. When I finished, she reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. She told me these were not accidents or casual concerns. She said she had seen families like this in the hospital, where one spouse or child slowly painted an older relative as incapable to gain control. She called it elder manipulation, and the word struck like a match. I felt tears sting my eyes. She squeezed my hand and said I needed two things: legal protection and medical proof of my clarity. She gave me the name of a lawyer, Daniel Brooks, someone she trusted who specialized in elder rights. She said he had helped her neighbor when a nephew tried to take over her finances. I wrote his name and number in my notebook. That afternoon, I called Daniel's office and made an appointment. His secretary spoke crisply, assuring me he often handled cases involving power of attorney and guardianship disputes. The words alone tightened my stomach. When I met Daniel 2 days later in his office near Pike Place, I found a man in his late 50s with a kind but direct manner. He asked me to tell my story from the beginning. As I spoke, he took notes on a yellow pad. When I described Sophie's questions about my pension and her suggestion of a joint account, he set down his pen and looked at me with steady eyes. He explained that it was possible for someone to forge a signature or pressure a doctor into signing papers claiming diminished capacity. He said Sophie could petition for guardianship or power of attorney if she built enough of a case that I was unfit. He added that once such documents were granted, undoing them could be difficult, especially if Andrew supported her. I felt my throat close. Daniel leaned forward and told me I had already taken the right step by documenting everything. He advised me to keep my notebook safe, along with all my bank statements, insurance records, and the deed of sale from my house. He suggested I store originals in a locked safe or even a bank deposit box. He also recommended scheduling a neurological evaluation now, while I was sound and articulate, to create medical evidence of my capacity. I left his office with a folder of resources and a mix of dread and determination. On the bus ride home, I clutched the folder against my chest as though it contained my very identity. The next morning, I called Linda again and thanked her. She reminded me that preparation was power. I spent that afternoon gathering documents into neat stacks. I placed David's death certificate, the insurance payout letter, and my pension records into a fireproof box I bought at the hardware store. I added my notebook to the box each night after writing. When Sophie walked past my door and saw me sorting papers, she asked with a light laugh if I was spring cleaning. I smiled and said I liked to keep order. She nodded approvingly, but lingered, her eyes flicking to the safe on my desk before she left. I made a mental note to move the box to the bank before the week was out. That evening, while Ethan colored superheroes at the table, I told Andrew I had scheduled a routine neurological exam. I said I wanted a record of my mental clarity just for my peace of mind. He looked up startled and asked if something was wrong. I smiled and said no, that it was simply wise to have a baseline as I aged. Sophie was serving salad, and I saw the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Andrew hesitated, then said it might not be a bad idea. He added quickly that he trusted me, but the word trusted felt fragile like glass set on the edge of a table. Sophie placed the salad bowl down and said warmly that it was thoughtful of me to consider everyone's comfort. I kept my face calm, though inside I felt her satisfaction. That night in my room, I wrote everything down. I described Linda's hand on mine, Daniel's warning about forged signatures, Andrew's flicker of uncertainty, Ethan's innocence as he asked questions he did not understand. My handwriting pressed harder into the page than usual, the grooves deep enough to feel on the other side. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. I set down my pen and touched the notebook cover. For the first time in weeks, I felt not only fear, but also a thread of resolve. Sophie might be patient and cunning, but I was not helpless. I had friends, I had a lawyer, and I had proof. I turned out the light and lay still, listening to the faint rhythm of rain on the roof. Somewhere inside that rhythm was a pulse of hope, small but steady, reminding me that I was not yet defeated. The whispers reached me first in the most familiar place. At church that Sunday, I set a plate of lemon bars on the folding table, proud of their golden edges. A woman I had quilted with for years leaned close and said I was lucky to have Sophie keeping an eye on me. She added that forgetfulness is natural at my age. The words stung sharper than I expected. Before I could reply, Carol from down the street stepped in and said she had seen me handle details better than anyone. She looked at the woman until the smile faltered. Gratitude spread through me like heat. As the service ended, I watched Sophie glide across the fellowship hall, greeting everyone with soft laughter, touching hands and shoulders, praising Ethan's reading. She slipped my name into conversations, always with a tender sigh, as if caring for me was her holy duty. People nodded, admiring her devotion. I felt invisible inside her performance, my reputation folded neatly into her story. On the walk home, Andrew asked gently if I was all right. I told him I was fine, though inside I was boiling. Sophie linked her arm through his and said, "Kindness always comes back around." Her eyes shone, and I wondered who else she had already rehearsed her lines for. That afternoon, I took Ethan to the library. We curled into a chair with a book about whales. He asked if the doctor would give me a sticker like his pediatrician does. I laughed and promised to ask. He rested his head on my shoulder and said he liked how I always finished the big words. That single sentence reminded me why I had to fight. Later, while putting away Andrew's laundry, I noticed Sophie's office door left slightly ajar. A leather folder sat on her desk. My pulse quickened. I should have walked past, but something in me refused. I opened it and saw a document titled Household Incidents. Neatly typed lines listed every staged moment: missed medication, lost keys, gas left on. Each item matched the days I had recorded in my notebook. Notes in the margin used words like establish pattern and consider petition. A second page listed phrases for conversations, the very ones Sophie had been sprinkling into daily life, just worried, only trying to help signs of strain. 2 clinics were named, both known for issuing capacity letters quickly. In the back pocket lay a blank power of attorney form, its signature line waiting like a trap. A floorboard creaked. I replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, just as Sophie appeared in the doorway holding socks. She asked lightly if I had found the right bench for Andrew's shirts. I smiled and said I had. Her gaze flicked to the desk, then back to me. For one moment her shine cracked. Then she laughed, a sound practiced to perfection. In my room I trembled until I could breathe again. Then I wrote everything into my notebook with fierce strokes. I moved the notebook and my papers into a fireproof box and placed it in a bank deposit box the next morning. I kept only a small pocket notebook in my purse for daily entries. I would no longer sleep with evidence under my pillow. The gossip spread quickly. At quilting group, another woman mentioned hearing I was repeating stories and might need more support. She said it with sympathy that tasted of superiority. I replied evenly that I had never once missed a destination or failed a task. Carol poured me tea afterward and told me she believed me. She said she could always tell when a story was being twisted. Her words felt like a rope thrown across a dark river. At dinner, Sophie praised my roast chicken, then mentioned she had spoken to a pastor about support for families of elders. She said it would be good to have a note on file in case of emergencies. I smiled and replied that planning begins with listening to the person at the center. She shifted the subject quickly to Ethan's fundraiser. Andrew's eyes met mine for a second, troubled, before he looked away. He asked about my neurologist appointment and offered to drive me. Sophie volunteered too, but I told them I would take a ride share and perhaps meet for lunch after. I wanted control over my arrival, no hands guiding me through that door but my own. That night, I lay awake, the clock ticking, the refrigerator humming. I thought about the folder on Sophie's desk, about the women repeating her script at church, about Ethan's brave little question about stickers. I let the anger wash through me and then settle into resolve. Rage burns out quickly. What I needed was steadiness. In the morning, I gathered my identification and a sealed notarized statement Daniel had suggested I prepare weeks earlier. I placed it in my car glove box as a safeguard. I carried another envelope for the doctor with my medication list and a summary of events written in neutral language. Facts weigh more than whispers. As I opened the door to leave, Ethan ran up with his shoelaces trailing. He asked if he could draw a bravery star on my hand with a marker. I held it out. He drew a crooked star that looked like a sun and told me it would help me answer all the big words. I kissed his hair and told him it already had. In the driveway, Andrew stood with his keys. He told me to call when I was done and whispered that he knew I was strong. Sophie stepped out holding a travel cup and said she had emailed me a list of resources. I thanked her without breaking eye contact with Andrew. His nod carried hesitation and something new, a crack in certainty. I slid into the car, set both hands on the wheel, and felt the bravery star against the leather. The sky was low and gray, the air damp with the promise of rain. I backed out slowly and turned toward the clinic, the envelope on the seat beside me. The city opened wide ahead, and I told myself that each step I took, each word I recorded, would be another stone laid against the tide Sophie was building. The morning began quietly, with sunlight sliding across the kitchen tiles and the smell of cinnamon in the air. Sophie greeted me warmly, setting a bowl of oatmeal at my place and pouring me a cup of chamomile tea. She said she had made it especially for me, something soothing before my appointment later in the week. I thanked her, though the sweetness in her voice carried that same careful polish. I lifted the spoon, ate a few bites, and sipped the tea. Within minutes, a heavy fog crept over me. My tongue felt thick, my hands clumsy. Words tangled on my lips. Andrew appeared in the doorway just as I tried to answer his question about Ethan's soccer game. My reply came out slurred. His face drained of color. He rushed to my side, his arm steadying me as the spoon clattered to the floor. Sophie gasped, hand pressed to her chest, and exclaimed that something must be terribly wrong. Andrew called for an ambulance, his voice sharp with panic. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights cut across my eyes. Nurses slid needles into my arm, drew blood, checked my pulse. I drifted in and out, hearing fragments. Elevated sedatives, not prescribed. Observation overnight. Andrew sat in a chair at my bedside, his head bowed, his hand gripping mine. Sophie hovered, explaining to anyone who would listen that perhaps I had confused my medicine, that older people sometimes take the wrong pills. She said it gently, as if she was sorry to have to say it. I wanted to shout that she was lying, that I had been careful, that I wrote everything down, but my mouth betrayed me, words dissolving before I could form them. So I stared at Andrew instead, willing him to see the truth in my eyes. He stroked my hand and whispered that we would figure it out. The next morning, the doctor entered with the lab results. He explained that a sedative, one not in my prescriptions, had been detected in my blood. Andrew's eyes widened. Sophie gasped again, murmuring that she had read about accidental ingestion. Maybe I had picked up an old bottle by mistake. The doctor frowned, said such medication was not something typically mixed up in a kitchen cabinet. He recommended I rest, avoid stress, and review all medications at home. When we returned to the house, Andrew moved quickly through the cabinets, pulling bottles down, reading every label. He muttered that nothing matched. Sophie followed, saying, perhaps I had dropped a pill from a visitor, perhaps even from Ethan's asthma inhaler. Her explanations grew thinner, stretched like fabric ready to tear. I kept silent, but inside a storm raged. I knew she had slipped something into my tea. The dizziness, the timing, her immediate excuse. But without proof, my words would only sound like paranoia. I retreated to my room, lay still until the pounding in my chest slowed. Later that evening, I went to find a file in the cabinet where we kept utility bills. Andrew was nearby, hunched over the kitchen counter. On his laptop screen, I glimpsed a familiar black and white image of the kitchen. A security feed. He told me quietly that he had installed cameras months ago after a burglary in the neighborhood, mostly to keep an eye on Ethan when babysitters were over. I asked if the kitchen was always recording. He said yes, a rolling week of footage. He clicked through, looking tense. When he left to take a call, I sat at the computer. My hands shook as I scrolled back to the morning of the oatmeal. The images flickered, then steadied. There was Sophie alone at the counter. She opened a small bottle from her handbag, tapped out a pill, crushed it with the back of a spoon, and stirred the powder into my tea. She moved with calm precision, pausing only to wipe the spoon clean before setting it in the sink. Then she placed the cup on the table and called my name. The room tilted. I covered my mouth to stifle the sound, clawing up my throat. My eyes blurred, but the image burned itself into me, every movement carved deep. I replayed it twice to be certain. There was no mistake. This was not forgetfulness or rumor. This was an attempt to break me from the inside out. I closed the laptop quickly, heart hammering. My legs felt weak as I climbed the stairs. In my room, I pressed my palms to my face, then reached for my notebook. My handwriting came jagged at first, then steadied as I wrote the date. The video evidenced the exact sequence of actions. I underlined Sophie's gesture of wiping the spoon. I noted Andrew's installation of the cameras. Each detail mattered now more than ever. At dinner, Andrew said little, his eyes darting from Sophie to me. He asked if I felt stronger. I said yes. Sophie smiled gently and told him she had researched natural teas for sleep. My stomach turned. Ethan chattered about his soccer game, unaware of the undertow pulling at the table. Later that night, I heard Andrew in the kitchen opening bottles again. Drawers slid, cupboard doors shut. His movements were deliberate, almost frantic. Sophie asked if he was looking for something. He said only that he wanted to be sure Ethan's medicine was safe. His voice cracked at the word safe. In my room, I lay awake with the notebook open on my lap. The bravery star Ethan had drawn on my hand faded, but still faintly visible. The video had given me something stronger than suspicion. It had given me truth carved in pixels and timestamps. But the truth still lived inside that machine, and I knew Sophie would try to erase it if she ever discovered what it held. I pressed the pen harder against the page and promised myself that by morning I would find a way to secure the evidence before she could touch it. The morning after the hospital scare, I called Linda and asked her to come by. We sat at my small desk with the blinds drawn the laptop between us. My hands trembled as I opened the camera feed. Together we watched Sophie at the counter, the pill, the careful crush, the stir into my tea. Linda's lips pressed thin. She said softly that this was no longer a suspicion. I saved the file to 3 flash drives, one for her, one for my bank deposit box, and one for Daniel. I added notes in my pocket notebook circling the timestamp twice. 2 days later, an envelope arrived from Rainier Trust. Inside was a letter thanking me for my request to update my power of attorney documents. My blood ran cold. Attached was a form with my name and a signature scrawled in clumsy imitation of my hand. The date matched the week I had been in the hospital. My chest tightened as I stared at the ink. Sophie had not only poisoned me, she had forged my name. I placed the letter in a plastic sleeve and added it to my folder. That evening, while Sophie busied herself in the kitchen, I told Andrew I had received something from the bank that did not make sense. He asked to see it. His brow furrowed as he compared the signature to one on my driver's license. He muttered that it was off, that it looked wrong. Sophie called from the stove asking what we were talking about. Andrew folded the paper quickly and said nothing. His eyes flicked toward me unsettled. The next morning, I met Daniel in his office downtown. His tie was loose, his eyes sharp as I laid the folder on his desk. I showed him the flash drive with the video and the letter from Rainier Trust. He watched the footage silently, then leaned back with a long breath. He said this was clear evidence of intent to harm paired with attempted financial control. He told me to keep it guarded, not to confront Sophie, and to allow him to begin drafting protective filings. He said the combination of video, the forged POA request, and my documented notes created a shield strong enough to withstand court. I asked what to do about Andrew. Daniel hesitated, then said his support would be powerful, but could not be forced. He advised that Andrew accompany me to a neurological evaluation. A doctor's certification of clarity would close off the path Sophie was trying to build. He recommended Dr. Stephen Morrison, a neurologist known for thorough reports. He said Andrew's presence would anchor the truth in his mind. That evening at home, Andrew sat with me at the dining table after Ethan had gone to bed. His face looked drawn, as if shadows had carved themselves into him. I slid the letter across to him and reminded him of the video he had already glimpsed. He sat silent for a long moment, then whispered that he did not know what to believe. I told him belief was not required, only observation. He rubbed his forehead and said he had begun checking every pill bottle in the house. His hands shook as he admitted it. I placed mine gently over his and said I had scheduled an appointment with Dr. Morrison and that I wanted him there with me. Sophie entered then, carrying folded towels, her smile bright as ever. She asked if everything was all right. Andrew cleared his throat and said we were planning for my doctor's visit routine follow-up. Sophie's eyes narrowed just slightly before she nodded and wished me rest. I saw the calculation flicker behind her expression as she set the towels down and left the room. Later, alone in my room, I slid the flash drive and the bank letter into my safe and locked it. I wrote in my notebook every word of Daniel's advice, every line of Andrew's reaction, every twitch of Sophie's face. The pen pressed grooves deep into the paper. The days that followed felt taut. At church, whispers circled as usual, but Carol squeezed my shoulder and told me she admired my strength. Sophie continued her performance, praising me in public, her voice full of honey. Yet at home, Andrew began to linger in the kitchen watching when she poured tea, asking quiet questions about where medications were stored. I noticed him checking the locks at night, his jaw set. He did not speak openly against her, but his silence carried new weight. One afternoon, Ethan bounded into my room, holding a drawing of a house with 2 suns above it. He said one was for me and one was for Mom, so I would never be alone. I hugged him tight, my throat aching, knowing he could not yet see the storm beneath our roof. On the morning of the appointment, I dressed carefully and placed my notebook in my purse. Andrew stood by the door with his coat on, ready to drive. Sophie handed him a travel mug of coffee and kissed his cheek. Her eyes lingered on me, sharp as glass. I thanked her politely and walked past the bravery star Ethan had once drawn, still faint on my hand like a reminder. As Andrew and I pulled away, I saw her standing on the porch watching us. For the first time, I sensed she knew the ground under her feet was beginning to crack. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Andrew sat beside me, silent, his knee bouncing restlessly. When Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, he shook my hand warmly and led us into his office. The room was calm, lined with shelves of medical texts and framed certificates. I sat straight, my notebook tucked safely in my purse, and told myself to breathe evenly. The examination began with questions I expected. He asked the date, the day of the week, the name of the president. I answered clearly. He asked me to remember 3 words and repeat them later. I recited them back with steady voice. He asked me to draw a clock and set the hands at 11:10. I sketched the circle, placed the numbers evenly, and marked the hands without hesitation. Andrew leaned forward, watching closely, his brow furrowed, as though he wanted to be sure I did not falter. Dr. Morrison shifted to more complex questions, asking me to subtract by 7s to recall details of a short story he read aloud. Each time I answered fully my words, smooth, my voice firm. When he asked me to describe what I had done the day before, I spoke of baking Ethan's favorite muffins, walking 3 blocks to the post office, and writing in my journal. I could feel Andrew's eyes on me, measuring, listening. At the end, Dr. Morrison smiled and said I was fully alert, articulate, and entirely capable of managing my own affairs. He said he would prepare a written report stating I showed no signs of cognitive decline. Relief flooded me like warm water. Andrew shifted in his seat, staring at the floor. His shoulders eased just slightly, as though a piece of his fear had been peeled away. On the drive home, he gripped the steering wheel tightly. He did not speak for several blocks. Then he murmured that I had done well, that the doctor seemed certain. I told him certainty matters more on paper than in whispers. He nodded, jaw tight, and said nothing more. That evening, Ethan climbed into my lap with a drawing of a rocket. He chatted about school, then stopped suddenly. He said he had once heard Mom talking on the phone about signing papers for Grandma. He asked if that was why I went to the doctor. My chest tightened. I stroked his hair and told him the doctor only wanted to check how sharp my mind was and that everything was fine. He nodded, satisfied, and bounded away, leaving Andrew frozen in the doorway. His eyes darkened as if a thought had lodged too deep to shake. Later, when Sophie left for a late meeting, Andrew stepped into my room. His face was pale, his voice low. He asked me to show him everything. I opened the safe and laid out the flash drive, the letter from Rainier Trust, with the forged signature and my thick notebook. He sat at my desk, opened the laptop, and watched the video silently. His breath grew ragged as he saw Sophie crush the pill and stir it into my tea. He paused the screen and stared, his hand covering his mouth. When I showed him the bank letter, he whispered that he could not believe his wife's hand was behind it, yet the ink was undeniable. He turned the pages of my notebook, slowly reading the dates and notes. His eyes filled with conflict, like a man pulled in two directions by ropes tied to his heart. I told him I had given copies to Daniel, that the lawyer was preparing filings to protect me. I said this was not about dividing the family, but about survival. Andrew pressed his palms against his eyes. He muttered that he loved Sophie, that she had been his partner, but that he could not ignore what he had seen. He said he needed time. I reached for his hand and told him I did not need him to choose yet. I only needed him to witness. He looked at me, eyes wet, and nodded once. The next morning, I met Daniel in his office again. I handed him the bank letter in its sleeve and another flash drive with the video. He reviewed them carefully, then said this was more than enough to establish both motive and action. He said we would move cautiously, gathering additional evidence, but that I was secure. He encouraged me to continue documenting daily to avoid confrontation and to let the record speak. When I returned home, Sophie greeted me at the door with her usual brightness. She asked about my appointment, her tone smooth, her eyes searching my face. I told her it had gone fine, nothing more. Andrew appeared behind her, his expression guarded. He kissed her cheek lightly, then caught my gaze for a fraction of a second, a silent exchange I knew she did not notice. That night, long after the house had quieted, I sat at my desk and opened the notebook. I wrote about the doctor's exam, about Andrew's reaction, about Ethan's innocent words. I wrote about Daniel's advice and the way Sophie's smile sharpened when she asked about the appointment. My hand pressed the ink deep into the paper. The lines grew darker as I admitted to myself that the balance in the house was shifting. Andrew's faith in Sophie had cracked. The crack was small, but it was there. Outside, rain tapped against the window steady. Inside, I felt the faint stir of change, fragile as a candle flame, yet stubborn in its glow. Daniel's conference room looked out over downtown, the tall windows catching streaks of late afternoon sun that made the polished oak table gleam like fire. I sat at one end, Linda beside me, her calm presence steadying the nerves in my chest. Across from me, Andrew sat rigid, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Sophie was next to him, a thick folder in front of her, her smile bright but taut, as though painted on. She glanced around the room with practiced ease, but her eyes flicked often toward Daniel, measuring every shift in his face. Daniel began with deliberate calm. He thanked everyone for coming, then explained that the purpose was clarity. Sophie leaned forward at once, sliding her folder toward him. She said she had kept detailed notes on my decline incidents that worried her greatly. She opened the cover pages of neatly typed lists spilling out. With her softest voice, she recited supposed examples, pills misplaced stories, repeated keys, lost meals forgotten. She looked at Andrew while speaking, appealing to him like a witness on her side. Andrew's jaw tightened, but he kept silent. When she finished, Daniel nodded slowly as if weighing her words. Then he placed a report on the table. He handed one copy to Andrew, another to Sophie. He announced that this was the official evaluation from Dr. Stephen Morrison. He read directly from the summary, fully alert, no cognitive impairment, capable of independent management of affairs. His words filled the room like the toll of a bell. Sophie's hands stiffened on the pages. She let out a nervous laugh, saying, "Perhaps I had simply been having a particularly good day when tested." Her tone wavered at the edges, a small crack in the polish. Daniel did not argue. Instead, he reached for a remote. The screen on the wall lit up. The video played the kitchen in grainy black and white Sophie at the counter. She opened her purse, removed a small bottle, crushed a pill carefully with the back of a spoon, and stirred the powder into my tea. The sound of the spoon tapping the cup echoed faintly through the speakers. Silence fell heavy across the table. Andrew's eyes widened, his breath caught audibly. Sophie's face went pale, then flushed. She stammered that it had been a vitamin, something harmless to help me rest. Her voice shook, and for the first time she seemed unable to control the rhythm of her performance. Linda leaned forward, her tone sharp, asking what kind of vitamin required crushing and hiding. Sophie's lips opened and closed, no answer forming. Daniel clicked again, freezing the video on the frame where Sophie stirred the cup. He said quietly that intent mattered more than excuse. Then he pulled another document from his briefcase, a letter from Rainier Trust. He laid it in front of Andrew. The bank had confirmed that the power of attorney request had been fraudulent, the signature not mine, flagged as a forgery. A handwriting analysis had been completed. The evidence was absolute. Andrew picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the lines, then falling on the imitation of my name. His hands trembled as he compared it silently to the license in his wallet. He whispered that it was not my signature. His voice was hollow, as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Sophie tried to interrupt, saying banks make mistakes. Clerical errors happen, that she had never filed anything. Her protest sounded thin, fraying at the edges. Daniel spoke firmly, stating that the bank's legal department had verified the fraud and would provide testimony if required. He placed the forged request back on the table beside the video still of Sophie at the counter. The evidence lay there like two stones of undeniable weight. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his face ashen. He pressed both hands to his forehead and whispered that he could not reconcile this with the woman he had married. Sophie reached for his hand, desperate now, but he pulled away, the scrape of his chair against the floor loud in the still room. Her mask slipped further, her smile faltering into something brittle. Linda turned to me and gave a small nod, a silent reminder that I was no longer alone. I straightened in my seat, my hands folded on my notebook. For months, Sophie had chipped at my name with whispers and false kindness. Now the mask had torn away in front of witnesses, her pattern exposed. Sophie tried one last defense. She said she had acted out of care, that she feared for my safety, that all she had done was meant to protect the family. Her words tumbled over each other, rushing frantic. Andrew looked at her with eyes filled not with anger, but with disbelief, the kind that cuts deeper. He said softly that protection does not look like poison, nor like forged papers. His voice cracked on the last word. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the heating system, the distant horns from the street below, the rustle of Linda's sleeve as she adjusted in her chair. Sophie sat rigid. Her face flushed, her folder of false notes still open before her, like a stage prop no longer useful. Daniel gathered the evidence, calmly stacking the documents, the letter, the flash drive. His movements were precise. His voice steady as he said the facts were now on record and would guide the next steps. He looked at each of us in turn, then closed his briefcase with a quiet click that sounded final. We rose slowly. Linda touched my arm, her warmth grounding me. Andrew stood apart, staring at the floor, his expression hollowed by grief and shock. Sophie followed a few steps behind her heels, sharp against the marble hallway, the bright smile gone at last. Outside, the air was crisp, the city alive with sounds that felt sharper than ever. I breathed it in deeply, my notebook secure in my bag, my steps steady. The truth had been laid bare, the mask torn off in front of those who needed to see. Whatever storms still waited ahead, the performance was over. The house felt like it was holding its breath when the knock rattled the front door. It was firm and deliberate, the kind of sound that carried the weight of authority. Andrew opened it to find a tall woman in a dark blazer flanked by 2 uniformed officers. She introduced herself as Detective Carla Jones and held out a folded paper. Her voice was steady as she announced that she had a warrant to search the premises. Sophie appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. The color drained from her face when she saw the badge. She stammered that there must be a mistake, but Carla had already stepped inside, her presence filling the room with quiet command. The officers fanned out methodically, gloves snapping, their movements precise. Carla began with simple questions, asking whether medications were stored only in the bathroom cabinet. Sophie forced a smile and said she kept only vitamins. Her tone was sweet, too sweet. Moments later, one officer called from upstairs. He descended carrying a small amber bottle, its label marked with the name of a sedative none of us had ever seen prescribed. It had been tucked into the back of Sophie's dresser drawer. Andrew's face turned rigid. His mouth worked as though trying to form words that would not come. Carla set the bottle on the dining table, then looked directly at Sophie. She asked her to explain. Sophie's voice cracked as she insisted she had simply forgotten to throw them out, that they were old pills she had found years ago. The explanation rang hollow in the silence of the room. Not long after, the second officer returned, holding a folder. Inside were copies of power of attorney documents, drafts covered in handwritten notes. My name appeared again and again, signatures practiced with uneven strokes. Seeing my name twisted into a tool against me sent a chill through my spine. Carla spread the pages across the table, her gloved hand pressing them flat. The evidence spoke for itself. Sophie's composure crumbled. She cried that she had been trying to protect her family, that Andrew's business was failing, that I had money going unused. Her voice rose jagged and desperate. She reached for Andrew, but he turned his back, shoulders stiff, jaw set hard. Then Ethan came down the stairs, drawn by the raised voices. His small frame froze when he saw the officers. His eyes darted from the badges to his mother's red face, then to me. He ran into my arms, burying his head against my shoulder. I gathered him close, stroking his hair, whispering that he was safe, though my throat ached with tears. Carla gave a subtle nod, and the officer nearest Sophie stepped forward. With practiced efficiency, he pulled her wrists behind her back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the room, sharp as a gavel. Sophie screamed that she was misunderstood, that every choice she had made was for her family. She twisted against the cuffs, her words spilling into frantic pleas. Andrew stood rooted near the doorway. He did not turn when Sophie cried his name. His silence was heavier than anger, heavier than any accusation. He looked only at the floor, as though he could no longer bear the sight of her. The officers guided Sophie toward the door. She fought them, heels scraping against the hardwood, her cries splitting the air. I shielded Ethan's ears, holding him tighter as we watched. Through the window I saw the patrol car waiting at the curb, its lights flashing red and blue against the darkening street. Neighbors lingered on porches, their faces pale, their whispers carrying. The car door shut with a dull thud, muffling Sophie's screams. The officers drove away, and with them went the storm that had torn through our lives. Yet the air in the house did not lighten. It pressed down heavy, full of betrayal and grief. Inside, Andrew slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook silently. He whispered that he had loved her, that he had trusted her, that he had not seen until it was too late. His voice broke, and for the first time since the truth came out, I felt pity for him, caught between love and ruin. Linda arrived soon after her steps, quick, her expression grave. She placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder and spoke softly, reminding him that betrayal blinds even the best of us. He nodded without lifting his head. I sat on the couch with Ethan still clinging to me, his small body trembling. He looked up with wide, wet eyes and asked why the police had taken his mother. My heart clenched. I kissed his hair and told him sometimes people make choices that hurt the ones they love, but that he would always be safe with me. He held me tighter, and I felt his tears soak through my blouse. The night stretched endlessly. The house felt altered, as though Sophie's absence had left a hollow shape in the air. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the hallway, a ghost of the mask she had worn. The dining table stood littered with evidence bags, the shadows of what she had tried to build out of lies. Andrew eventually lifted his head, his face drawn and gray. He whispered that he was sorry for doubting me, for letting her shadow fall over us. I told him softly that sorrow was part of healing, that the truth had found its way through no matter how heavy the lies had been. He looked at Ethan asleep against me and closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. The patrol car was long gone, its lights faded from the street, but their reflection remained in my mind. Sophie's mask had not only cracked, it had been torn away in full view of the law. Justice had entered our home and taken her with it. What remained was the silence of a family broken, and the fragile hope that healing could one day grow in the hollow she left behind. Spring came with a quiet softness, the cherry trees blooming along the streets of Seattle, as though the world itself wanted to remind me that renewal was possible. The house no longer carried the sharp tension that had once hung in every corner. Ethan's laughter filled the rooms again, light and unburdened, while Andrew moved with a heaviness that only time could ease. Months had passed since Sophie was taken away in handcuffs. Her trial drew headlines for a while, the story of a daughter-in-law accused of forging power of attorney papers and slipping sedatives into tea. I sat in the courtroom every day, my notebook in my lap, the weight of truth pressed into its pages. When the verdict was read, I felt a tremor course through me. Sophie was found guilty of fraud and attempted poisoning, her scheme calculated to seize nearly $1 million. The judge's gavel fell, sentencing her to years in prison. She did not look at me as the deputies led her out, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Andrew sat beside me, his shoulders slumped, his hands clenched. When the courtroom emptied, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. He whispered that he was sorry, that he should have seen sooner, that he had doubted me when I needed him most. I reached for his hand. I told him that forgiveness was not about forgetting, but about choosing to carry love forward. I told him I forgave him, not to erase what happened, but to keep our family whole for Ethan. His grip tightened, and for the first time in many months, I saw relief flicker in his face. Life after the trial felt fragile at first. Ethan clung to me often, still startled by memories he did not fully understand. I spent afternoons with him in the park, watching him chase soccer balls, his laughter echoing across the field. At night, he would curl against me with a book, his small voice reading aloud, his eyes bright again. Slowly, the shadows that Sophie had cast began to fade. I returned to my church, standing once more in the fellowship hall where whispers had once bruised me. This time I spoke openly. I told the congregation what had happened, how lies and manipulation nearly stripped me of my dignity, how vigilance and truth had protected me. Faces that once held doubt now showed compassion. Some wept, some clasped my hands. I reminded them that elder abuse does not always come with bruises, that sometimes it wears a smile and speaks in gentle tones. I urged them to watch over their parents, their neighbors, their friends. One Sunday after service, a woman I barely knew approached me. She said she had worried about her sister being pressured into signing documents she did not understand. She thanked me for speaking out, for giving her courage to act. Her words reminded me why I had chosen not to stay silent. At home, Andrew worked to rebuild trust. He checked in with me daily, asking if I needed errands run, if I felt safe, if Ethan was thriving. His firm was still burdened with debt, but he worked tirelessly, determined to mend both his career and his place in our family. I could see the weight of regret in his eyes, yet I also saw resolve. He was learning as I was that healing is not sudden, but steady. Sometimes at night when the house grew quiet, I would sit by the window with my notebook. The pages were filled with pain proof and perseverance. I no longer needed to write every detail, but I kept the habit. It reminded me that truth leaves a trail, that even in the darkest times, clarity can be found if we are willing to mark our steps. Ethan often joined me, climbing onto my lap with his sketchbook. He drew rockets, whales, and sometimes families holding hands. One evening, he looked up at me and asked if I was glad I had not forgotten the big words. I kissed his cheek and told him the only thing I had ever forgotten was how much strength lived inside me until I was forced to remember. The absence of Sophie left a wound, one that would not close quickly. Andrew grieved in silence. Ethan asked questions in whispers, and I carried my own mix of sorrow and relief. But there was also peace. The storm had passed, justice had been served, and truth had been restored. In the months that followed, I chose to share my story beyond the church. Community centers invited me to speak, and I told the same truth each time: that age does not make us helpless, that manipulation can wear a friendly face, that lies can cut as deeply as any weapon. I told them I was never losing my mind. I was losing my name to someone else's lies, and that those lies eventually carried their author into handcuffs. Now, as I watch Ethan running across the yard, his laughter carrying into the open sky, I feel both lighter and stronger. My son sits on the porch steps, his head bowed, but when he looks up and meets my eyes, I see something steady at last. We have survived the breaking of illusions. We are mending in the light of truth. If you have ever seen injustice hidden behind a smile, if you have watched someone twist trust into a weapon, or if you have lived through betrayal that left scars, I invite you to share your own thoughts and experiences. Let your words become part of the warning, part of the healing, and part of the compassion that keeps others safe. Together we can make sure silence never protects the wrong side of truth.